Welcome back, everyone, to our Facebook Live series. And we're happy. Andy Zemenides, Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council. And we are happy to be joined by a good friend who is a regular guest on our podcast and in-person programming, Dr. Aykan Erdemir, a Senior Fellow for the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, a former member of parliament in Turkey, a world-renowned advocate for human rights and religious freedom, and last year's recipient of HALC's First Freedom Award. Aykan, welcome back.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for the kind invitation and the warm introduction. Always a pleasure to join you.
Aykan, we'll jump right into it. You had a piece that we posted on our Facebook page for our viewers. I highly recommend that you go read that. But it's on war on the rocks, and it's about Erdogan's latest moves to improve U.S.-Turkey bilateral relations. One might argue it's just a straight-up personal appeal to President Trump to get him to intercede in this fraying relationship. Tell us a little more. Give us a background of the piece for people who haven't read it yet.
Sure. Those of us who have been watching U.S.-Turkish relations were not surprised when two military planes full of personal protective equipment landed in Washington's, St. Andrews Air Base. And this we saw was the latest move in Turkish President Erdogan's charm offensive targeting President Trump. And besides these two planes load of gifts, there was also a letter where Erdogan praised his own spirit of solidarity. But he did more than that. He also delayed the activation of the Russian S-400 air defense system, which he had committed to activating this April, which of course came at a horrible time. Erdogan gave the excuse of the COVID-19 pandemic for the delay, but as you can guess, there is absolutely no connection between the pandemic and the air defense system. But we know there is a stronger connection between the activation of the system and the imminent CAATSA sanctions that the US would impose for buying a big-ticket Russian military hardware. But there is more at stake. We see both of these moves, the gift of personal protective equipment as well as the delay in the S-400 activation, as Erdogan's latest ploy to convince President Trump to politically intervene in the workings of the US Federal Reserve so that the Fed would grant Erdogan a no-strings-attached lifeline in the form of a swap deal. Such swap deals do exist between US and Mexico, US and Brazil, but as we all know, the Fed is an independent, autonomous authority. They look into the merits of each case, and when it comes to Turkey, almost all financial analysts agree that Turkey's current economic situation, its lack of an independent, well-governed central bank, precludes a swap deal with Turkey. But the big question here is, will President Trump fall for Erdogan's charm offensive and provide him a lifeline?
So there was a lot packed into that. I want to start with, because we've talked with you before about the S-400s and the rest, but I do want to start with this swap deal. You have been writing from long before the COVID crisis about the economic challenges that Turkey faces. And, you had raised Turkey perhaps needing to go to the IMF. Can you get into the weeds a little bit? Why is Erdogan, and you refer to it in your article, but why is Erdogan pursuing a swap instead of an IMF agreement?
First of all, let's give the economic landscape. Turkey's fundamentals were messed up long before the COVID-19 crisis. So this is not just about the pandemic. This is about almost a decade of mismanagement, corruption, money laundering, self-enrichment, finally taking its toll on the macroeconomic indicators of Turkey. Just to give you one number, Turkey's non-financial corporations today have foreign exchange liabilities totaling some $300 billion. And one-third of that is in short-term loans. And given the Turkish lira lost 20% of its value just year to date, you can imagine the squeeze these non-financial corporations are in, given their revenue stream is in Turkish liras, but their outstanding liabilities are in dollars, US dollars, or euros. Hence, Erdogan has not many options. He can either turn to the IMF for a standby agreement, but we know that standby agreements come with strings attached, especially conditions for transparency, accountability, anti-corruption measures, anti-money laundering measures, good governance when it comes to the central bank, Turkish Statistical Institution, and the finance ministry. And under Erdogan, we know none of that would be possible. Hence, Erdogan's plan B, and that is a lifeline that comes with no strings attached, a swap line with the Federal Reserve. Now, again, on its merits, this is not possible. And given Turkey's central bank lost all of its autonomy, in fact, Erdogan started appointing people without economics degrees, and the current central bank of Turkey shares Erdogan's unorthodox view that high interest rates cause inflation. So every time there is a need for the central bank to spike interest rates in Turkey to support the currency, to bring the inflation down, the central bank does just the opposite. And there is no way that the Federal Reserve would like to enter into a swap deal with a central bank that has all the fundamentals of the economic science wrong.
And, it raises the prospect. It's always been interesting watching Erdogan, not only with President Trump, but with President Obama before, trying to create this one-on-one relationship with the president to override the rest of government. And it looks like, he's setting President Trump up for a real fight with the rest of the United States government. You noted in your piece, but we've heard him before, Ambassador Satterfield in Turkey has said, basically has said that Turkey is not eligible for this, that there are clear monetary and financial requirements of the Fed. There is no political link. The Fed that, President Trump has targeted for internal reasons for not lowering interest rates enough. I can't imagine that they're going to, as they're expanding their balance sheet, take a risk on Turkey. And Congress doesn't seem to have any appetite to give Turkey a blank check without accountability and transparency. Do you anticipate a fight within the U.S. government over this?
Now, this is the election year, so I believe an incumbent president would not like to bankroll Erdogan, because for the U.S. taxpayers, that means the U.S. is basically paying for Erdogan's splurge on Russian military hardware, a sanctioned Russian military hardware. So the optics of such a deal would be horrendous, would be disastrous in an election year. Is there a way out for the White House? There is, and that is with the U.S. Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, because unlike the Federal Reserve, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, by law, is a fund where the Secretary of the Treasury has considerable discretion, and he only needs the presidential approval to allocate some funds. But there is a catch there. The current amount in the Exchange Stabilization Fund is $93 billion. And the amount Erdogan's Turkey needs as of 2018, according to a Business Insider estimate, was $75 billion. Most financial analysts today see the meltdown in Turkey to require $100 to $150 billion. So even if Trump says, I am going to allocate all the funds in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, where I have, political leverage, it still will not be enough to bail Erdogan out. So ultimately, I think it's in everyone's best interest, including Turkish citizens in the United States, in other NATO members, in the European Union, to direct Erdogan to the IMF for a standby agreement. This is the only way whereby Turkey can get back on structural reform, on taking small steps toward strengthening independent, autonomous regulatory institutions, but more importantly, put an end to Erdogan's parallel budget, to all these off-balance sheet funds he has been using, including the Turkish Wealth Fund, including all his revenue guarantees, including all his slush funds for his cronies. The path to reform would go through the IMF. So this is, I think, an opportunity that President Trump should not miss.
Let's talk about the risks for Turkey. If they don't go to the IMF, and it's unlikely they're going to get this swap or stabilization assistance, you noted in your piece, and we've seen this, that their foreign reserves are almost run out. It is ironic that they've built such a close relationship with Venezuela, because it looks like they're hurtling towards a Venezuela type situation. What are the risks for Turkey's economy, and how bad might the harm be?
Now, Erdogan has a few other options, but they're not good options. If we exclude a swap deal, an exchange stabilization fund bailout, or an IMF bailout, then there are two options. The first one is let the markets take their toll. Let the Turkish lira float fully, which would mean a substantial devaluation. But given non-financial companies have $300 billion of foreign exchange liabilities, this would mean massive bankruptcies across the spectrum. Then there is the other option, which we are, I think, inching towards, with Erdogan's almost daily meddling in the markets, and that is capital controls. Erdogan has been doing his best through banking regulatory agency moves to limit various types of capital flows in and out of Turkey. For example, just yesterday, Erdogan limited the amount of lira transactions Turkish banks can enter into with foreign financial institutions. Now, the problem here is that if you meddle too much in the markets, if you put the fear of capital controls not only in Turkish citizens but also in international investors, then this will, first of all, put a sudden stop to external financing, and second, possibly trigger a run on banks. Turkish consumers have, for the most part, invested most of their savings in foreign deposit accounts in Turkey. But if they begin to feel that they might not have access to these US dollars and euros, they might start behaving in a panicky fashion, thereby triggering a run on banks. Hence, the only way out of this crisis is by building strong institutions, building trust in markets, building trust among investors and consumers. However, Erdogan is in no position to do that. What complicates the problem is the person at the helm of the Treasury and the Finance Ministry is no other than his son-in-law, Berat Albayrak. Yeah. So Erdogan cannot really put the blame on a dysfunctional minister, because he has given all the economic and financial powers to his son-in-law, namely the finance minister and treasury minister. So this is quite a bind. My prediction would be that Erdogan will run the economy to the ground. He will refuse until the bitter end to do the right thing, that is an IMF bailout package. He will move closer and closer toward capital controls. And the problem here is, you mentioned Andy, Venezuela, but with, Iran, Lebanon, Venezuela, we're talking about countries that have little exposure to global markets, meaning the fallout, the contamination effect would be relatively smaller compared to Turkey. Turkey is not a rentier state. It's not a hydrocarbon state. It has huge liabilities in the amount of debt it accrued through its non-financial and financial companies. And furthermore, Turkey is also an important export and import market, especially for the European Union. So the contagion effect here could be immense.
And it seems that Erdogan is a little bit counting on that. He's playing the too big to fail card. And in fact, we have a question from John, one of our viewers, who says, who are the major investors, who stand to lose the most in the case of a Turkish default or economic collapse? We've heard him threaten Spanish and Italian and French banks. And this reminds us a little bit of the euro crisis too. But who are the potential biggest losers here?
Yes, in terms of bank exposure, the top four happen to be Italian, Spanish, French, and German banks. Now, what sounds horrible to you and me sounds like an opportunity for Erdogan, as you underlined. He is the mastermind of playing the too big to fail card. So as we speak, there are back channel talks with various European central banks to also arrange alternative swap deals. And we can be sure that Erdogan is playing this card. He's saying, look, if I fail, your banks, which have tens of billions of dollars and euros of exposure to Turkey, will also be burned at the worst moment in the COVID-19 crisis. But let's also keep in mind that Erdogan also has another card up his sleeve, and that is the refugee card. We have earlier this year seen how Erdogan weaponized in the most inhumane, in the most callous way possible, immigrants, not just Syrian refugees, but immigrants across the board. He declared that Turkey's borders with the European Union, namely with Greece and Bulgaria, are open. He then started busing Syrian refugees as well as other immigrants from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Iraq, from Africa to the border, and then encourage these immigrants and refugees to basically run over the EU borders. And this irrational policy only came to an end when the COVID-19 crisis made such weaponization of refugees and immigrants also a security and a public health threat for Turkey itself. So then Erdogan ended this ill-advised policy, but you can be sure that he will once again try to play the immigrant card as well as the too big to fail financially card. And so I'm watching closely how especially Germany will respond, the UK will respond, because Turkish Central Bank reached out to the British Central Bank. This has been, on the record. But the governor of the Turkish Central Bank also mentioned some other talks, although he didn't name any other banks. We can be sure that Angela Merkel is watching closely, and let's see if she also falls for Erdogan's ploy.
Thank you for bringing up the weaponization of migrants move that Erdogan pulled, which got not enough attention because it dovetailed with the news cycle on COVID. And that's got to be a real worry right now, because he's shown himself willing to do this in 2015. This time again. And now with the COVID crisis, that you don't know whether these migrants and refugees are carriers of the virus as well. But as the weather warms up and the Aegean becomes easier to cross, that's something that's a real threat once again. Let's go to the S-400s. All right, he has them in storage. He has. His defense minister has. His presidential spokesperson last week on another call all declared that we miss activation date just because of the COVID crisis. Ambassador Satterfield has declared and said that the administration has made it explicit that these S-400s are not compatible either with Patriot missiles, air defenses, or with the F-35 program, and that they have not received assurances to mitigate their concerns. Is the bar by the administration for mitigation of the concerns lower than the bar that Congress or anybody else has? And is somebody trying to give Erdogan an off-ramp to be able to get F-35s and S-400s?
Now, when it comes to mitigation, I think let's be clear. Because here, when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about the risks posed not just to Turkey, not just to Turkey's neighbors, not just to NATO, but to basically to the most sophisticated system the transatlantic alliance has, and the risks posed by Russian eavesdropping on the stealth features and other characteristics of the F-35 jets. Because that was Erdogan's plan from the outset, co-locating and cooperating the S-400 air defense system with the F-35 stealth jets. Now, this would be akin to, destroying, over $1 trillion worth of, defense project and technological advances, just because Erdogan believes the two systems can be operated together without exposing the F-35s to any risk. Now, when this question is up, I think the Department of Defense, as well as all other defense analysts in and around DC, they have been on the same page that this is not a risk that can be mitigated. I know Erdogan has been constantly making offers to set up joint committees to discuss this, to solve this issue, but I haven't seen any respectable military analyst who thinks that this issue can be solved through some bilateral or multilateral committee meetings. I think where there is a difference of opinion is when it comes to the CAATSA sanctions. Yes, Congress, for the most part, in a rare bipartisan, let's say, act, would like to go forward with CAATSA sanctions. And I think with the NDAA last December, they have expressed their commitment to go forward with the sanctions, even if President Trump is not interested in the sanctions in the immediate future. But beyond that, I think there is now an emerging, quote-unquote, realist thinking, school of thinking in Washington, that would like to present Turkey as a potential counterweight to Iran and Russia. There have been some optimistic thinking when Turkish forces and proxies clashed with Assad's forces and Russian and Iranian-backed proxies in Idlib. And so they started assuming that, maybe Turkey is pivoting away from Russia and we can win Turkey over once again. In my humble opinion, this is a very simplistic and misleading way of thinking about the issue. Anyone who has watched Erdogan closely over the last decade must have seen his strong pivot toward Russia and Iran and facilitation and enabling of both Russian and Iranian hegemony in the Middle East. Just to give a few concrete examples. Turkey voted against UN sanctions against Iran's nuclear program as a temporary member of the Security Council. Turkey helped Iran evade US sanctions. to the tune of $20 to $30 billion. Turkey has been working very closely with Iran and Russia in the Astana process, and even holding back-channel intel meetings with the Assad regime these days. So I think it would be naive to assume that Erdogan's Turkey could be a counterweight to Iran, to Russia, and other NATO adversaries in the Middle East. Hence, this brings us back to the key question of, shall the US and other NATO allies look the other way as Erdogan starts activating and using a Russian military hardware? Or should there be a stronger, vocal, and kind of more, concrete pushback from the US and Turkey's NATO allies? I believe it is in the best interest of Turkey, NATO, US, and all transatlantic members in question if Erdogan gets a strong pushback and Erdogan is forced to either mothball the system or return the system, which I, by the way, don't believe is happening anytime soon.
And you're right, it would not only be naive to assume, you would have to suspend reality, because last week, Ambassador Kalin, Erdogan's spokesperson, he declared his relationship with Russia, or their relationship with Russia in Syria, is sometimes we will be with Russia, sometimes we will not be with Russia, sometimes we will be allied with Iran, sometimes we will not be allied with Iran. It's a very transactional and non-principled relationship, and that's not the basis for going forward in NATO and with these systems. And you pointed out in your piece, and it's something that's very important to emphasize, because people at the beginning of the No Jets for Turkey campaign, you had your own anti-F-35. People treated this S-400 concern as a theoretical concern, but Turkey has already tested the S-400s on American jets. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So, so far, most debates in Washington revolves around, will Turkey activate the S-400s or not? But I think what a lot of people are missing is that Turkey has already, at some level, activated these systems and even tested them against Turkey's very own F-16 jets. So what we're talking about at this point is, simply full operational capacity. Because already there has been, at a minimum operational capacity, a testing of the system against against a NATO system. And in fact, when that test happened, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticized Turkey. But at this point, I think we're all pretending as if that did not happen. So we would still like to offer Erdogan an opportunity to pretend as if mothballing or returning the system is still a possibility. And also, there is one issue I'd like to mention. The Turkish military officers who are now stationed with these Russian air defense system batteries are the first in the Turkish history to be trained fully in Russia. And this also provides Russia another opportunity to meddle in Turkish and NATO affairs, because this is, again, the first cohort with Russian training who will rise up in the ranks of the Turkish military. And the longer this relationship continues, and keep in mind Erdogan even discussed Russian jets with Vladimir Putin during an air defense show last year, all of these could lead to further military-to-military cooperation between Turkey and Russia, which will increase the number of Turkish officers with Russian training, with greater exposure to what I would consider authoritarian, illiberal values of the Russian system, as opposed to Turkish officers who have had exposure to the transatlantic values through their training and co-work with their NATO colleagues.
And all this at a time where Turkey's strategic thinkers, or Erdogan's handpicked strategic thinkers, are more Eurasian in worldview than they are transatlanticists. But as we're coming up to the end, I want to get into some internal politics. We've been talking about geopolitics and geoeconomics. Obviously, last year, Erdogan suffered major electoral defeats. The opposition, the liberal opposition, may have new standard bearers, the mayor of Istanbul, who had to beat Erdogan twice, the mayor of Ankara. How is Erdogan using the COVID crisis to perhaps do another purge, consolidation of media control, and to punish these political opponents?
Now, Erdogan's greatest blessing during this pandemic has been the opposition-run municipalities, especially the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara have had a stellar performance. They have reached out across the political spectrum to all those in need and often pushed the government to take action. But instead of seeing these mayors as partners in tackling the pandemic, Erdogan has turned this into a zero-sum game, and he has taken steps which would be unthinkable in any democratic country. He has, first of all, banned these municipalities from their aid campaigns. He has shuttered their accounts, prevented them from running soup kitchens, and he has even started a legal investigation into the mayor's aid activity, outreach activity to those in need. When we come to the pro-Kurdish mayors in Turkey's predominantly Kurdish southeast, we have seen Erdogan using the crisis as yet another opportunity to crack down on those municipalities, remove elected pro-Kurdish mayors from office, and replace them with his hand-picked trustees. This, again, is an ill-advised policy, because what Erdogan is doing is basically removing mayors who have a strong connection, linguistically, culturally, to the population in Turkey's southeast, and replacing them with hand-picked Erdogan cronies who have little or no connection, linguistic or cultural or historical connection to these constituencies. And this is, of course, a recipe for disaster, both in the metropolises, in Istanbul and Ankara, as well as in these Kurdish majority cities in Turkey's southeast. But overall, this is Erdogan's game plan to exploit the pandemic to consolidate his one-man rule further. He has tried to push through draconian laws to control the social media. He is now considering a legislative change to amend Turkey's presidential election law again, because he realizes he can no longer gather 50% plus one for a two-round presidential election. So he's now contemplating turning it into a first-past-the-post system, and he hopes he can just get by with 40% with his support from Turkey's ultra-nationalists. And all of this points to a very dark path for Turkey, whereby Erdogan, rather than using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity for reform of Turkey's public health and democratic institutions, is using it as an opportunity to consolidate an autocratic one-man rule, which will turn out to be disastrous for Turkey and its neighbors.
Yes, disastrous. And democracy has been on a backslide. We hope it can come back. Something you've been outspoken about, you and your wife, and have paid a heavy price for, is the rights of religious minorities. There was a question from Nick saying, I assume Dr. Erdemir is in exile. It's not you don't have to assume. His citizen has been stripped. He and his family have paid a heavy price. He's threatened. But he still keeps speaking up on the status of Christians in Turkey during the Brunson case. Actually, I have to hats off to Dr. Erdemir. I think he was a big reason why it was front and center in the policy debate. Just last month, he and his wife were vocal in commemorating the Armenian genocide. But USCIRF just came out with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom just came out with a report recommending that the State Department classify Turkey as one of the worst religious rights violators. We have seen that before. Sometimes we've seen that up and down, that when USCIRF gets out there, then the State Department or the administration replaces all the commissioners. Do you think this is the days of people putting on blinders as to what Turkey is doing to Christianity internally, or what Erdogan is doing to Christianity? Is we're going to start being fully honest about that?
Now, I've been following USCIRF's work very closely and working very closely with commissioners and the staff who do wonderful work. And for those of you who are not familiar with USCIRF, this is, an independent, nonpartisan federal body that monitors religious freedom violations around the world. And there are two categories. One is the worst offenders category, is called the country of particular concern. And Turkey was in that category only once in 2013. But for most other years, we see Turkey in a second tier, which used to be called the watch list. Then it was called the tier 2. And as of this year, it's once again called special watch list. So this is a category where countries are about to become countries of particular concern, which means they could be sanctioned by the US, but they're not yet there. To be frank, at the height of the Pastor Brunson crisis, when Turkey was jailing not only him, but many other Western persons for who they are or what they believe in, there was talk of putting Turkey back into the CPC, country of particular concern category. And those debates still continue. And when we take a look at this year's report, there's still the damning criticism of Turkey's ill treatment of religious minorities, including Christians and Jews and Alevis and others, as well as atheists and agnostics. But what is striking is this: Turkey is the only NATO member that is listed as in the special watch list. And Turkey is one of the two members of the Council of Europe, alongside Azerbaijan, listed again in the special watch list. And what's more alarming, in my personal view, is that Turkey is not just criticized under the Turkey chapter, but Turkey this year was also criticized under the Syria chapter, because Turkey and its proxies are basically in violation of fundamental rights and freedoms, freedom of belief and religion, not only in Turkey, but transnationally. And the report was very clear in condemning what it called as ethnic and religious cleansing carried out in northern and northeast Syria. This, I think, is a pattern that will remain, meaning as Erdogan's pan-Islamist and neo-Ottoman politics become increasingly global, as his footprint becomes increasingly global, we will see Erdogan's violations of minority rights and religious freedoms not just on Turkish territory, but in Syria and elsewhere too. And this, of course, is particularly a sad episode, because we all know the historical and contemporary suffering of the minority communities in northern Syria, including Yazidis, including Armenians, including Chaldeans, including Protestants, as well as ethnic minorities, Kurds and others. So this remains a particular concern, I think, not only in Washington, but across the globe.
So last question, so we can tie the geopolitics and geoeconomics to these questions about concerning democracy in Turkey. You have asserted that Turkey becoming less democratic will have really negative geopolitical ramifications. What does it mean for Greece and the East Med, which is coming together, right? If we went 10 years ago or even 7 years ago, when the White House had Turkey as celebrated as a golden child, and the East Med was in bad shape, but now East Med is coming together. What is an increasingly authoritarian and non-democratic Turkey mean for the positive developments in this region and the future of this region?
So as Erdogan consolidates power, sidelines Turkey's, established bureaucracy, including the foreign ministry, and runs policy within a narrow circle of yes men at the palace, we see an increasingly belligerent and irredentist Turkey. And this is an irredentism not only concerning land borders, but also maritime borders, including EEZ, exclusive economic zones. Now, during the COVID-19 crisis, some optimists again assume that the ongoing crisis could limit Erdogan's aggressive behavior in the Eastern Med, not only concerning hydrocarbon resources, but also in Syria and in Libya. Again, I am a little skeptical about this. I had a recent piece in the Turkey Analyst where I looked into, Turkish policy in Syria and the impact of COVID-19. And I don't think there is legitimate grounds to be optimistic that Erdogan will be in a better behaved mode just because we have a pandemic. On the contrary, a lot of Erdogan's belligerence in the Eastern Med, all the way from Syria to Libya, have coincided with political and economic crises he had at home. So the rally around the flag effect of escalating a political and military crisis offers Erdogan an opportunity to divert his electoral base's attention away from his mismanagement and corruption at home. Hence, when it comes to Erdogan's policies, I remain as concerned as ever in the Eastern Med. And when it comes to the Turkish opposition, and because we have to keep in mind that Turkey is not Erdogan, although Erdogan is setting policy for Turkey today, Turkey still has at least another 50% that believes in a secular, pro-Western Turkey, and that is committed to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's ethos, and that is peace at home, peace abroad. So if there is any glimmer of hope that we can leave this conversation with, and that is from the local elections in Turkey, whereby half of Turkey's population that produced 2/3 of Turkey's GDP have elected opposition mayors. And the Turkish opposition seems to be getting its act together, managing to build alliances across these deep divides in Turkish politics. And it is our hope that once, if and when, they can defeat Erdogan at the ballot box and replace him at the presidential palace, restore parliamentary democracy in Turkey, Turkey will gradually and hopefully rapidly, actually, go back to a policy that is not a zero-sum policy, that is a win-win policy that sees a brighter future for itself and for the region through these positive, collaborative, solidaristic relations with its neighbors. Turkey has been there before. We might remember how Foreign Minister Ismail Cem and Papandreou moved Turkey and Greece forward, moved Turkey and the EU forward. We hope that Turkey can once again return to those bright days.
And let's end on this optimistic note, because I think we need some optimism in every country right now. Thank you. We could go on forever with you. That's why we keep having you back, and we will have you back again. We wish you and your family good health stay safe. We're looking forward to your next piece. I think you may be coming out with something in Gati Merini soon. And speaking of that, I'll give all our viewers a little bit of a early commercial at the end of this week. We're going to be having Tom Ellis on our Facebook Live series to discuss week one of Greece's slow opening after COVID. So, Aykan, thank you, and we look forward to continuing conversations and moving closer to your hopeful aspirations than we are today.
Thank you again for hosting me. Thank you for the kind words, and let's all keep safe and continue to believe in a secular, liberal, democratic future for Turkey and the neighborhood.
Thank you.